All right, folks, so we're going to go over last week's reading, and let's start with a quick review. All right, so your major goal of quality improvement is ensuring quarterly audits. Your quality improvement program is not restricted to just quarterly audits. So because this answer is restricting you to a certain time frame, that makes it wrong. All right, so that's incorrect. Addressing whether or not EMTs have their BLS CPR training. Again, the quality improvement goal is not as finite as focusing on one aspect of EMS training. Public receiving the highest standard of care. That would be what we're seeking to ensure in the end, is making sure that the care we deliver is appropriate. But we're still going to look at answer D to make sure that that couldn't be possibly the answer. And it refers to information in the billing department. And quality improvement does not just look at one single department. Perhaps quality improvement will look at billing as part of an EMS agency, but they don't ever tend to look at just one facet. So that would be incorrect as well. Online medical control, and I apologize that this screen is not lining up perfectly with the PowerPoint slides. I've tried to adjust it and it's just not cooperating. So online medical control, the operative word being online. Darn it, I cannot get my pen to work appropriately. I keep forgetting that I have to highlight it every time. So online is the operative word there, okay? So since it says written here, that makes it incorrect. Phone or radio contact with the medical director, that's online, so that could be correct. The presence of an advanced life provider, advanced level life provider has no bearing on online medical control. And a physician's presence on the call has nothing to do with being online either. So again, yes, it is B. All right, so ADA referring to Americans with Disabilities Act, which of these is correct? Well, first of all, the first answer says it applies only to individuals with physical disabilities, and that's incorrect because first of all, when you see a word only in an answer, it's probably not going to be correct. So just tuck that away in your test taking strategy. And the fact that it refers to physical disability only, ADA refers to any disability. The minimum number of hours required to complete an EMT class is less for candidates who are disabled. That is not what the goal is, and therefore it's not correct. It prohibits employers from failing to provide full employment to those who are disabled. That is more what it describes. It's basically saying that if you're able to do the job, you should be allowed to do the job, and that you can't be barred just because you have a disability. And then this, of course, does not apply because you're not exempt. So this answer is incorrect. So C would be correct there. General adaptation syndrome. So which is most correctly depicting that syndrome with one of these phases? Alarm, reaction, resistance, and recovery. That sounds correct. Delayed reaction, alarm, and physical recovery. No, because typically your alarm comes before your reaction. So that's not correct. Reaction and resistance, euphoria, these aren't even, euphoria is not even part of the equation. Immediate reaction, psychological exhaustion, and then recovery. Yes, the term psychological exhaustion is not typically utilized, so A would be correct there. Following statements regarding an emergency move. The spine must be fully immobilized. You cannot do an emergency move if the spine is fully immobilized, right? Because that's going to require taking C-spine precautions, putting them in a C-collar, and securing them to a board of some kind. So that would not be consistent with an emergency move. The emergency move is not performed before the primary assessment necessarily. It's something you may do certainly before the primary assessment, but you might do it at any point during the assessment. So you might complete your primary and then the scene becomes unsafe, necessitating you do an emergency move. and you remove them after the primary but before treatment. So that wouldn't be correct. The patient is dragged along their long axis. This is correct because this is, again, going to be moving a patient when the scene becomes immediately unsafe for the provider or for the patient. That's typically the reason why we do an emergency move. We can also consider doing an emergency move if our patient is in cardiac arrest. So basically, you're going to move along the long axis of the body in an effort to minimize spinal injury. Okay, we're going to avoid going across this way, but instead move up and down. It's not possible to do an emergency move without injuring the patient. That is not correct. So this is the correct answer. Which statement is correct? So again, we just talked about this in the previous slide. So an additional call pending is not considered an emergency. You are to address one call at a time. So we don't do an emergency move simply because there's another call pending. So that would not be correct. It can be used when the scene is becoming unsafe. That is correct. When your shift is ending so that you can get out of doing your shift more quickly, no, that's not when we use it. Used with the patient's permission, you don't necessarily need the patient's permission to do an emergency move. You're allowed to protect your own safety and that of their safety as well, whether or not you have their permission. The proper technique for the power grip, lifting with your palms up, that's the best way. Rotating palms down, that relies more heavily on the strength of your hands, and you don't want to rely on just one muscle group when you're doing the power grip. Holding the handle with your fingers, definitely not. And this mathematical equation has nothing to do with anything, so that's incorrect. All right, so palms up is going to be ideal. That does not rely on the strength of your fingers, and your hands more likely can lock around the bar that way without taxing your fingers themselves. Simplest and most effective method of preventing the spread of an infectious disease. I told you that this would pop up somewhere, and so a physical exam is not going to keep you from spreading disease from your person to another patient or from patient to patient. Your immunizations will not protect your patients from getting the cold if you transmit a cold virus from one patient to another. Washing your hands in between patient contacts will do that, however. And just like immunizations, undergoing tuberculosis and hepatitis testing is not going to prevent you from transmitting the cold virus or a flu virus from yourself to a patient or a patient to a patient and so forth. Vector-borne transmission is going to be transmission of an infectious organism via a certain vector, and typically that's going to be animals and insects, not smoke or dust or direct contact or inanimate objects. It's usually a vector where they can sting you in some manner, and that's what we mean by vector-borne. You've got an instance where you're providing care and blood gets on the ambulance. The stretcher wasn't cleaned properly, and so virus was left on the cot and transmitted to an EMT. So this was not direct because it didn't go from person to person. Whoops, darn it, I keep forgetting to highlight that pen. So that doesn't apply. Indirect contact, where the virus went from the cot to the EMT rather than virus going from person to person, that would be direct, right? Indirect goes from person to cot and then to person. So this is indirect because it didn't happen by air and it wasn't due to a vector of some kind. Your first priority is going to be personal safety. That cannot be emphasized enough. It comes before rapidly responding, it comes before treatment and transport, and it comes before empathy for all patients. The idea is that if you're not safe, you can't provide any of these things to your patients. All of these are part of patient care, but patient care comes after your safety. Okay? Always. All right, so the simplest and safest way, this looks familiar, to prevent the spread of infectious disease. I think we already talked about that, so this ended up there twice. I want to say it's because I wanted to emphasize a point, but it might be that I just entered it twice and didn't realize it. All right, so we're done with the review. So let's move on to what we're talking about this week. So what we're going to talk about is first anatomy and physiology, and next we'll move on to patient assessment. All right? We're going to look at the different systems because the systems will affect each other. We'll talk about impending quiz items, and then when we talk later about emergencies by system, then we'll get into the detail of that specific organ system in general, okay? Then when we address patient assessment, we're going to do an overview of the principles behind it, and then on Thursday, we'll begin to go over the actual techniques in the lab itself. All right, so here are the planes of the body. And it's important that you note that your patient is in anatomic position in this position. Okay, so we have the patient with palms facing forward. And that is the hallmark of anatomic position. And it helps us refer to the appropriate plane, right? So we have our frontal plane, the coronal plane. So if you were to draw a line right here dividing the front from the back, your frontal or coronal plane would be the front, and the transverse or axial plane would be the back plane. And then you also have planes that, refer to the top and the bottom. So sagittal is going to be dividing your patient in half this way, from right to left, and that's going to always be the patient's right and left, not our right and left, okay? And then the back side of the patient actually is referred to the dorsal plane or the posterior. So dorsal, I always think of a dorsal fin like on a shark, and that's going to be the posterior. All right, so keep in mind this is, once again, this position is anatomic position. So when we look next at the skeleton, the head, neck, and torso are the axial skeleton. And when we look at the skeleton, we have the different sections. So you've got the cervical vertebrae, and you'll note there are 7 of them. And then the thoracic vertebrae, and you'll note there are 12. And then the lumbar, and you'll see that there are 5. Now, those 3 sections are the vertebrae that will articulate. These vertebrae below this level, the sacral and the coccygeal, are both fused, which means they will not articulate, they won't move. So one little trick to remember the order is that you have breakfast at 7, you have lunch at noon, and you have dinner at 5, and that's way a lot of people will remember how many vertebrae are in those 3 sections that articulate. And of course you have a total of 33 vertebrae altogether, including the ones that articulate and the fused vertebrae. Now, if you look at the sacral section down here, these little indentations are actually holes in that bony structure. And what will happen is that nerves will branch off of the main spinal cord, and as you can see, will head down the leg. Because buried inside this, or running through the center of the vertebrae, is the spinal column. And the spinal column, the best way to think of it, is an electrical conduit. Okay, and it allows electrical transmissions to run from the brain down the spinal cord and then to branch off to each of these peripheral nerves. So this is the spinal cord. And then these are peripheral nerves. This is not keeping up very well. I'm writing faster than this computer program can keep up with. All right, peripheral nerves. I'm not going to try and write it out because it's not cooperating. All right. So when we look at purposeful movement, the brain is going to transmit that impetus or that impulse down the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord, down the spinal cord, and let's say you want to wave goodbye with your left hand, that will then get transmitted down the side and down to your left arm. Now, if we compare that with the appendicular skeleton, that refers to our appendages. So that's going to be the arms and the legs, and those appendages are comprised of joints, obviously buried in them. And these testable items in particular will be these two types of joints. So this is going to be ball and socket. Excuse me, let me go backwards again. This one is going to be a ball and socket joint right here. And you'll find ball and socket joints at the articulation of the humerus bone that articulates with parts of the clavicle and the scapula. You will also see it at the hip, where the femur articulates with the pelvic bones. Then we have hinge joints, and we see those almost everywhere else in the body, right? Where we articulate our limbs, our fingers, and so forth, okay? So these are quite likely to show up in a quiz, examples of that. All right, so now moving on to the different types of muscle in the body. The first one we're going to talk about is skeletal muscle, and that is going to be the muscle that comprises the lion's share of the bulk of muscle that we have in the body, and that's going to be this muscle right here. Now, when we say it's voluntary, another word for voluntary is somatic, because it falls under the somatic nervous system. Your nervous system is broken down into different categories that are in charge of different tasks. So any task that is something that you decide to do is considered to be voluntary or somatic, and the muscles that control that are going to be skeletal muscles. So you have control over the skeletal muscle in your body. And you know how it works. You decide to walk across a room, and all the muscles that transport you and enable you to do that are skeletal muscles. Okay? The next type of muscle is going to be smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle is under the part of the nervous system that's considered involuntary. And another word for involuntary, when we're talking about the nervous system, is going to be the autonomic. Autonomic. And it sounds or makes me think of automatic, all right? So when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, that is the part of the central nervous system, it's a branch of it, that controls smooth muscle, but it also controls cardiac muscle. So these other two types of muscle, smooth and cardiac, are under control of the involuntary or the autonomic nervous system. And then all the other muscle, which is skeletal muscle, is going to be under control of the voluntary or the somatic nervous system, as we see up here. So again, 3 types of muscle in the body. 2 of them, the cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, are going to be under automatic control. And then skeletal muscle is going to be under the control of the voluntary or somatic nervous system. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. So again, the name for voluntary control of skeletal muscle falls under the somatic nervous system, and smooth muscle and cardiac muscle fall under the control of the involuntary or autonomic nervous system. So we'll say that this is the central nervous system here, and we know that the central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. And then it breaks down into voluntary and involuntary control, and skeletal muscle controls this side. Smooth and cardiac muscle is controlled here. And then the question of when these muscles act differently is going to be based on whether or not you are in the sympathetic side, which is fight or flight, or the parasympathetic side, which is feed and breed. Wow, I swear my handwriting is not this bad, but I'm asking my computer to do a lot because I've got multiple programs running. So this is fight or flight, sympathetic, and this is feed or breed, parasympathetic. All right? So the smooth muscle that is going to be affected is primarily going to be the blood vessels, because you've got smooth muscle inside your blood vessels. So let's say here's a blood vessel. All right? And inside your blood vessel is going to be the smooth muscle that lines the inside. Now, when that blood vessel is relaxed, it might appear to look like that when the blood vessel is relaxed. And you can imagine that hole is larger, blood flow is improved. But if that muscle constricts, then that means that blood flow is decreased because there's less room in that opening. So that smooth muscle will constrict or dilate and can affect the size of the blood vessel and therefore affect the blood flow through that blood vessel. You also have smooth muscle in your GI tract, and that smooth muscle is responsible for digestion of food. It squeezes and releases, and like how you would squeeze a toothpaste tube, and pushes food through your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine, as it goes through the various stages of digestion. And that smooth muscle can either be stimulated to work more during certain parts of the central nervous system's response to stimulus, or to constrict less often. Then you have bronchioles that also have smooth muscle in them, and similar to the size of blood vessels, we'll say this is a bronchial tube, okay, and it's leading to these structures in your lung called the alveoli, where oxygen exchange is going to take place, right? Because these alveoli are also covered with blood vessels, venules, as well as arterioles. So we know that oxygen is going to travel down the bronchioles until it makes it into the alveoli. All right. Now, if these bronchioles, which are also lined with smooth muscle, if the bronchioles are nice and relaxed and dilated, there's a nice open space for the oxygen to travel through. However, if there's marked bronchoconstriction occurring because of either exposure to something that is irritating the bronchioles, or because one side of the nervous system has been triggered, and it's going to be the parasympathetic side where you get bronchoconstriction, then the size will be altered and the amount of gas exchange can be altered as well. So the smooth muscle is affected by the sympathetic side and the parasympathetic side, but it depends on where in the body you find the smooth muscle and which side of the central nervous system or the autonomic nervous system that the body is in that determines which blood vessels constrict or dilate, whether or not the GI tract smooth muscle constricts or dilates rapidly or slowly, and whether or not the bronchioles constrict or dilate. And in addition to that, cardiac muscle is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system to beat faster and stronger. And when you're in the parasympathetic side, your cardiac muscle relaxes and goes into a slower rate and a less strong squeeze. All right? So the sympathetic side, again, is the fight or flight side. The parasympathetic side is the feed or breathe side. So when we're in the sympathetic side, and that is triggered simply by a feeling of being in danger. You don't have to actually be in danger, you just have to think that you're in danger. So if this is your brain, and all you do is think that you're in danger, then that can trigger the sympathetic nervous system. All right, the sympathetic nervous system will then, there's a portion of the brain that will get triggered, and it will send an impulse down to your adrenal glands. All right, and your adrenal glands are going to be sitting way down here on top of your kidneys. And that signal will make it down to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands will dump adrenaline into the bloodstream, and that will make all of the following effects take place. So, one of the first things that happens is you get an increased blood flow to the heart, the lungs, and the skeletal muscle. Because if you're going to run or flee from something that is putting you in danger, namely a dog chasing you, or a bacterial infection, you need an increased heart rate, And to make that happen, you need increased blood flow. You need increased blood flow to your lungs and increased blood flow to skeletal muscle, because if you actually need to run and flee, you're going to need an increased blood flow to those structures. But you're going to have a decreased blood flow to your gastrointestinal system and to your skin. Okay, so Mother Nature is basically robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's kind of like when you use multiple computer systems, and you've seen it in my presentation. I've got multiple computer systems open, and so the one that is needed the most, my ability to write on the screen, is the one that is basically starting to fail first, right? Because being able to see and hear the words on the screen is being deemed more important, and this goofy little pen is working less efficiently. And the body is the same way. To get these parts of the body to work most efficiently, we have to give the blood flow to those parts of the body. And therefore, we're going to take the blood from parts of the body that don't need it right now to engage in the fight or flight response. Now, it's not like we're cutting off the blood supply altogether. We're just reducing it here and increasing it in the heart, lungs, and skeletal muscle. If we look on the parasympathetic side, which is where we live most of the time, we end up having increased blood flow go to different parts of the body. So, for example, during the feed and breathe side, which is again where we tend to reside most of the time, we have an increase in blood flow to the GI system and the GU system. The heart and lungs are being perfused well, but since most of the time we're digesting food and we're being out in the ambient air, the blood flow will be increased here, and it will also be pretty constant there. But it'll be reduced, comparatively speaking, to skeletal muscle, because we don't use the skeletal muscle to the same degree that we're using our GI and GU systems. So we're constantly taking food and water in, and our body is constantly filtrating the blood, or filtering rather the blood as it circulates through the kidneys after picking up nutrients and water from our digestive tract. And we're producing urine and waste products all the time. So basically we have increased blood flow where it's in red, a pretty good blood flow certainly at the heart and lungs in pink, and then a decreased blood flow, comparatively speaking, to the skeletal muscle during the parasympathetic side. So again, this is where we are most of the time. So your brain, again, we have the brain here using the central nervous system, the spinal cord, but in addition, here's your brain again. In addition to the spinal column that originates off the brainstem, the brainstem is buried inside the brain, and as it exits the skull right here, it becomes a spinal cord. But while the brainstem is inside the skull and inside the brain, it's referred to as the brainstem. And the brainstem has a number of big nerves that branch off of it, and they control our vision, our hearing, our ability to taste, our ability to smell, our ability to move the muscles in our face, our neck, and our upper shoulders. And it also has a very important nerve called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve branches off of the brainstem, fishes through the meat of the neck, down into your thorax, and the first thing it does is it innervates the heart. So let's draw that as a heart. When we say innervates, we mean it controls the heart. And the control of the heart follows the rate of the parasympathetic side, which is 60 to 100. But then, when you feel like you're in danger, the brain sends a trigger down the central nervous system spinal cord to the adrenal glands the adrenal glands dump adrenaline into the bloodstream circulates all around, and then it overrides this effect so that your heart rate increases because of this effect. So we'll go over this more as we proceed through discussions of various medical emergencies, but that's kind of a down and dirty of the autonomic nervous system. So in the brain itself, we have different structures in the brain. So we have the cerebrum. The cerebellum is going to be, excuse me, I forgot to highlight my pen. The cerebellum is going to be this structure right in here. I didn't use a good pen color. Let's see if I can pick something blue. There we go. So this structure in here is the cerebellum. And then this is going to be part of the brain stem still. All of this. And again, we're going to say that this gentleman's mouth is here, his chin is here, and so basically the brain stem will end somewhere in this region as it exits the skull, and then it continues, but it's called the spinal cord. Wow. That color does not show up really well against the screen, and I apologize. So again, we talked about this at the beginning. It's an extension. The spinal cord is an extension of the brainstem. So any information that comes from the environment, darn it, I keep forgetting to highlight that pen. So stimulus that comes from the environment is going to get transmitted this way. Okay, so this is the affective or affective path. So it's information from the environment and it goes to the brain. So if it's cold outside, your skin is going to pick up that information, pass it through the peripheral nerves to the central nervous system, up to the brain. The brain is then going to respond with an effect. So the brain is going to say, all right, I need you muscles to start shivering, and I need you to start shivering, and I need you to start shivering. And that's the effective path with an E. So there's paths that go into the spinal column up to the brain, and then there's another path that has circuitry that goes from the brain back down to the body. All right, so hopefully this pathway will remain intact and uninjured, because this is how information gets passed back and forth from the brain to the body and from the environment to the brain. Now, moving on to the respiratory system. And we're just basically going to break this whole body down into systems. So you can see here that your respiratory system has all the structures noted. All right. The apex of the lung, apex referring the top of the lung, okay? And the diaphragm is going to be the muscle that initiates breathing. But the true initiation of breathing comes from the brain. Because again, the brain is receiving information from the environment, and when the brain decides that your carbon dioxide levels are too high, then the brain will send a message down to the diaphragm. All right? And right now, the diaphragm right here is in its relaxed position. When the brain triggers the diaphragm, the diaphragm will pull down this way. And when it pulls down in this manner, it's going to bring the lungs with it. So the lungs are going to stay attached to the diaphragm and they're going to get pulled down. And so now the lung size has increased from this size all the way down to here. So when you increase a space, when you increase the size of a space, the pressure inside the space drops. So decreased pressure in the space. That decrease in pressure is also called a vacuum. Right? We know that. And when we have a vacuum, air rushes in. And that is basically the physiology of the respiratory system. All of these structures make it possible. Your nasopharynx and your nasal air passage are also called your nares, are your nostrils, okay? They have what are called turbinates inside. They're bony prominences that increase the surface area, so instead of air passing by this short distance and only coming into contact in that short area, the folds basically increase the surface area, so as air passes across here, there's more surface area it comes in contact with, and so it increases the likelihood that the air that's entering your nasal passages will be humidified and warmed. The oropharynx can serve the same purpose, but to a lesser degree because you have a smaller surface area. Now, other structures are going to be the epiglottis, which is a structure that folds over or closes over the trachea when you're breathing, when you're eating and swallowing, and opens up, flips up when you're breathing. The larynx is right below the epiglottis. These are right next to each other. And at this point, everything above this point is the upper airway. Oh, this computer program is just slowing down from my pen. And everything below that point is going to be your lower airway. Wow, this is really crapping out. I'm not going to even try to write lower. Lower should be below here. So the larynx, the vocal cords, everything above it is upper, everything below it is lower airway. And then your trachea is going to bifurcate or split in two right here at the carina. And if you take your fingers and feel between your collarbones at that notch at the top of your sternum, and take the pads of your index and middle finger and just start to slowly press down on your sternum about 2 inches below that notch, you'll feel a slight bump there. And that marks the location of the carina or the bifurcation of your trachea into your right and left main stem bronchus. Now, the drawing is actually incorrect here. It should be this side actually points downward more, and this side branches off more. These are just structural things that are consistent in people because it allows for this space for the heart right in here. So the structure of the lung, the shape of the lung is a little bit more concave on the patient's left side, and therefore, because the left lung kind of swings out of the way a little bit, the main stem bronchus on the left side kind of swings more sharply off to the left as well. All right, and then as your bronchioles get smaller and smaller, they're going to eventually end at the alveoli where gas exchange takes place in these tiny little blood vessels. So air will move down through into these balloon-like structures that are covered in what I think of as Christmas tree lights on bushes during Christmas time. It's covered in that manner, and gas exchange takes place in the capillary bed at the alveoli in the lungs. Okay, and then gas exchange in the rest of the tissue also takes place at the capillary bed in the other tissues. We'll go over this in more detail when we start to study respiratory emergencies. But one last thing I'd like to point out to you. Not sure if you made out these red pieces. This is smooth muscle that's wrapped around the bronchioles themselves. And this smooth muscle will constrict and dilate based on whether or not you're in the fight or flight or the feed or breed response. So if you are in the fight or flight response, these muscles will relax to allow this hole to stay nice and large so air can pass more readily through your bronchioles. So other structures worth noting is going to be your thyroid cartilage, which is the Adam's apple. Men and women both have Adam's apples. What's different is that this part, darn it, I forgot to do the pen again. This part becomes thickened when men go through puberty. Testosterone causes this portion of your Adam's apple, your thyroid cartilage to get thicker. So women have Adam's apples too, just that we don't have the same level of testosterone circulating freely in our bloodstream, and therefore we don't have the same thickening of that structure. Now below that is the cricoid cartilage, and in between the two is the cricothyroid membrane. So if you palpate your own Adam's apple and then let your finger slide below it, you'll feel a little divot, and then below that you'll feel a smaller bump than your Adam's apple. This ring, this cricoid cartilage ring, is the only cartilaginous ring that forms a complete donut. The rest of the cartilaginous rings are basically horseshoe shaped with the opening at the back. This one is different, however. And so if you were to press on this, you might be able to suppress secretions that are coming up through your upper airway or making themselves evident in your upper airway if you're attempting to assist a paramedic with intubation. We can talk about that at another time. All right, so again, this is just another view of the structures. As we talked about before, your diaphragm is the primary muscle of breathing. In adults, however, we also see use of our intercostal muscles that are integral to our ability to breathe. So your intercostal muscles are going to be those muscles that lie between your ribs. So if these are your ribs, we know that underneath each rib is going to be blood vessels. Okay, and there's going to be arteries as well as veins. Okay, and in addition to that is going to be a nerve pathway, which is why people are so ticklish around their ribs, because you've got nerves right there. All right, and then in between those ribs are going to be muscle in blue. And those muscles will suck in when you're breathing hard, okay? But typically, unless you're a very, very, very lean person, we don't see these muscles suck in on inspiration so much, okay? Nonetheless, we use all of these muscles throughout our chest and the intercostal region to assist with decent chest rise, in addition to the diaphragm contracting from here all the way down to here, all right? And that's going to happen on inspiration. We also use, to a certain degree, some neck muscles, pectoral muscles, abdominal muscles as well. Children are big belly breathers, and they really don't use pectoral muscles much or neck muscles very much. These muscles aren't very developed in their pectoral area, but if you see them using the neck and pectoral muscles, you know that they're working very, very hard to breathe, and that's a sign of respiratory distress in children. Now, some other terminology that you'll see when it comes to your respiratory status or the respiratory system is the difference between ventilation and respiration. So again, with ventilation, we're talking about the mechanics of breathing, and that's going to include the contraction of the diaphragm so that it pulls downward, as we talked about, the lungs following it, and creating a vacuum because you've made the space bigger inside and air rushes in. Then when the diaphragm relaxes, it makes the space smaller, and that pushes the air back out. Mechanics of breathing is ventilation. All right. Now when we talk about respiration, we're talking about a different process here. Respiration is gas exchange. All right. So that's going to be when the gases make it all the way down to the alveoli. And remember, we said that the alveoli are going to be covered with blood vessels, right? And as the oxygen makes its way it's going to pass into the arterioles and get transported back to the heart to be pumped to the body. And then, of course, as you're exhaling, you're going to be exhaling carbon dioxide out because the carbon dioxide is going to be dropped back into the alveoli to allow you to exhale it out. So that gas exchange that takes place at the alveoli and then farther away in the body at the cellular level, that's going to be respiration. So we can see that cells are constantly working. Their byproduct of work is carbon dioxide. They will transfer that carbon dioxide into the bloodstream, and then oxygen will be taken from the bloodstream into the cell. And that exchange is going to, again, be called respiration. So if you were to look at the entire circulatory system, and that's what this word says, the circulatory system is probably cut off, we can see that this process is taking place constantly, all over the body. All right, so we're going to assume that whenever we see this structure, this refers to the capillary bed. And these capillary beds, of course, are all over the body. We've all had tiny little pin pricks in our skin, and there will be a tiny little pin prick worth of blood that comes to the surface because all over the body we have these capillary beds. And this is going to be where carbon dioxide from the cells is going to be transferred into the capillary bed and then returned to the heart, where it can travel to the lungs, get dropped off in the lungs to be exhaled out of the body, and at the same time, or immediately after you exhale that out of the body, then you're going to inhale oxygen back into the lungs. That's going to travel to the heart, where it's then going to be fed to the cells. And this process is constantly taking place in the body. So that leads us to a discussion of the heart itself. And what's important to understand about the heart is it's a hollow organ, obviously. It's muscular in nature. The largest part of the musculature is going to be in the ventricles, all right, which is going to comprise the bottom portion of the heart. Now, if you look at the way it's situated in the body, it's tilted off to the side in this regard, and actually tilted a little bit forward as well. This upper part here is going to be the atria, and then the bottom part is going to be the ventricles. Now, what's occurring right in here is actually parts of blood vessels. So the right ventricle will feed into the pulmonary artery, which will branch off into arteries that lead to the lungs, and then buried underneath and coming out over the top is going to be your left ventricle that leads to your aorta, which is then going to head downward, of course, in this direction, as well as branch up to go over to the arms, to feed up to the brain, and what have you. Once the blood travels in that direction and feeds all the cells in the body, all those capillary beds are then going to feed into the vena cava, which is going to then return back to the right atria, right ventricle, and then go to the lungs to pick up oxygen. And then it'll start the process all over again. All right? So you have valves embedded in the heart to prevent backflow from one chamber into the other, because the contraction of the heart is going to be traveling in this way. So once the blood leaves the atria and goes into the ventricles, and then the squeeze of the ventricles will swing back up to squeeze the blood out like toothpaste, you don't want the blood to travel backwards. So there are valves that prevent that from happening. So it'll be a good idea by the time we start studying the cardiology piece that we start to learn the names of all the structures. The valves here, the valves there, there's 4 sets of valves, as well as the different structures in the heart. So if you were to look at a map of the body, you would see that this is the layout of the major blood vessels in the body. You do not have to know all of these blood vessels. The big ones you need to be aware of are going to be the aorta, the vena cava. The aorta branches off here and returns to the vena cava, returns to the heart right here. The femoral artery, knowing where to palpate that. The dorsalis pedis artery is going to be on the top of the foot. And then the radial artery is going to be what we palpate as part of our pulse checks, as well as the carotid artery is what we palpate as part of our pulse checks. Okay, so basically knowing where those blood vessels are. The capillaries, again, are going to be branching off of arterioles and venules. So cells are constantly giving up their carbon dioxide and taking in oxygen from these structures. As they give up the carbon dioxide is going to return and be absorbed into the venules, and that will then go to the veins, and the vein eventually will go to the vena cava. And the vena cava heads back to the right side of the heart. So the right atria. And then from the left side of the heart, we have the blood being pumped from the left ventricle to the aorta to deliver freshly oxygenated blood. So there's the order of the path of blood through the body. And then we start it all over again, constantly. All right, so the components of the blood are worth noting as well. We have the blood vessel, and then we have red blood cells, which, once again, I forgot to press the pen. So we have the red blood cells, which you can see here. They're kind of a donut shape, and they're going to be the carriers of oxygen. All right, so the red blood cells carry the oxygen, all right, on the hemoglobin. And then you have platelets, and the platelets are actually kind of shaped like plates, and they'll stack on top of each other to help form the beginning of a clot. And then we also have white blood cells, WBC, as well as a number of other proteins that are part of the immune response, and all of it is floating around in this liquid medium called plasma. And I think I blew up this picture too much to be used for this application. Functions of the blood are pretty finite. The point, for the most part, is perfusion, delivery of oxygen, removal of carbon dioxide, as well as the transportation of nutrients, primarily from our small intestine. So your food gets digested, leaves the stomach, enters the small intestine, and from the small intestine you've got blood vessels wrapped all over it, and those nutrients will start to diffuse into the bloodstream that's wrapped around all those vessels wrapped around the small intestine, and then it'll be dispersed throughout the body, and then waste products will be transported back to either the kidneys or the colon. Where did my little icon go? Blood also has an important function of being able to coagulate or clot in order to control bleeding. Otherwise, we could conceivably bleed to death if we didn't have enough clotting factors. And people that don't have enough of those clotting factors are hemophiliacs, for example. Now that's going to bring us to the subject of the skin. I'm going to pause here for a moment